cannot live up to, to which I cannot live up, no, which I cannot live up to. There's the rule in English is that you're not supposed to end with a preposition. And Churchill famously said, ending a sentence with a preposition is something up with which we will not put. And if you have native English, then it's a ridiculous sentence, but grammatically perfect. So I cannot live up to the introduction, so thank you for... Okay. I'm going to talk, very casually about some things that I've written and spoken about before, but which I think make an interesting, coherent whole. These are all issues which really come together in terms of our understanding of Tibet. And since you have this program in Asia and Europe, I thought it would be good to include some things which really do relate to Tibet's contacts, traditional and non-traditional contacts with the outside world. Again, it's somewhat ironic when you talk about this, because the usual stereotype is that Tibet is isolated or has been isolated traditionally, when in point of fact, Tibetan literature is full of all sorts of things about India. The Indians traditionally have not been interested in history. They've been interested in philosophy, and a lot of what we know about the history of India comes in part from Tibetan sources. So this idea of isolation has to be tempered somewhat. The first thing I'd like to talk about here is the name of Tibet. In the 18th century, the Jesuit missionary Ippolito Desideri wrote in his Relatio, his account of Tibet, which, by the way, that account of Tibet, which he was there in the early 18th century, it wasn't discovered until the second half of the 19th century. And as I constantly tell my students, if that work had been known in the early 18th century, it would have saved scholars at least a century and a half of ignorance, and it would have advanced Tibetan studies certainly far beyond where it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Ippolito Desideri wrote with great surprise that in Tibet, nobody's ever heard of the name Tibet. And this astonished him. And then he wrote that the name actually is, and here he gave a nice little bit of linguistic data. He said the name for the country that people use is actually pronounced like the French word for a little bit of something, un peu. And that's there in his Relatio, un peu. And this is something which is... It's very interesting, because we come and, one can say this has something to do with politicized Tibetan studies. We come to the modern period in which, in which we have right now a mandated pronunciation of the Tang Dynasty name for Tibet. Now, the Tang Dynasty, of course, is from the early 7th century to the early 10th century. And in Tang writings, the name that one finds for Tibet is Tufan. This word Tufan. However, if you are working with materials in the People's Republic of China, and particularly if they're Romanized, and you can check later on if you want in online dictionaries, you'll find that this Tufan is generally given with the pronunciation Tubor. And as you might imagine, there is a reason for this pronunciation. This pronunciation Tubor is of recent vintage. The pronunciation really is Fan. And this is the same sort of Fan that you find used with regard to foreigners outside of China. But with regard to Tibet, it has been decided that it really should be pronounced Tubor. Now, there are Chinese characters which have some element of that second character, not the first one, the second character, which some elements of that are in other characters that are pronounced Bo and Po. But we have rhyming dictionaries, and it is absolutely certain and proven by no one less than Paul Pelliot that this cannot be pronounced Tubor, that it should be pronounced Tufan. I was once at a conference a number of years ago, and a colleague from the People's Republic of China was reading a paper about the Tubor Kingdom. And another colleague sitting next to me, a very venerable colleague, shall remain nameless, said, "Will nobody take pity on the poor man and tell him that Paul Pelliot in 1915 already proved that this is an impossible pronunciation?" And of course I had to say, well, this is actually something which is political. So the interesting thing is also that this pronunciation, Tubor, did not originate in the People's Republic of China. And I say the People's Republic of China because prior to the People's Republic of China, during the period of the Republic of China, when I was young, many centuries ago, and I was studying in Taiwan, and I was reading Chinese materials with teachers there, materials on Tibetan history, it was always Tufan. So this is something of recent vintage, but the interesting thing is it originates in the West, in the 19th century. Abel Remusat, William Woodville Rockhill, who, both of whom knew Chinese very well, discovered that the character looked a little bit like these other characters that are pronounced Bo or Po, and so the hypothesis was that this is really Tubor, and of course, what is the Bo? It is the Tibetan name Pe. Now, this has been adopted in the People's Republic of China because, among other things, it provides this nice little teleology. It accords with the teleology, which says that since the very beginning, the Tibetans and the Chinese have been growing closer and closer and closer. And by using this, the implication is that while the rest of the world had no idea what the country was called, in Tang China, they knew what the country was called. Now, there's a problem with that, and the problem is, what do you do with the tu at the beginning? If the name for Tibet is Pe, then what do you do with the tu? Well, there are some Western scholars. Most simply reject it because it has no foundation, and Paul Pelliot, again, showed that this is not the pronunciation of the character. But some people, and I know some of them who are not really Tibetologists, what they do is they look for a suitable syllable in the dictionary, which is the wrong thing to do. In other words, you've already come up with your conclusion. Now you just have to see what you can find to support it. So they come up with the names, the hypothetical names, Tope or Tepe, which would be sort of High Tibet or Upper Tibet. Now, what's wrong with that? That sounds pretty good. That sounds, feasible. Well, what's wrong with it is that it's not attested. That's the problem. What you want to do is look in writings, and we have the writings from Dunhuang, which date from the imperial period and shortly thereafter, and we have concordances, which give us all the syllables in their various contexts for the historical and for other works. And we don't have Tope and Tepe. So this is something that you sort of make up to fill in the gap. That's number one. Number two, what I always think is, say you're a Tibetan living in Tibet in the 7th, 8th century, and you really don't go very far. You're maybe you're a nomad, maybe you're in a village, maybe you go 50 miles, 100 miles from where you were born. Do you know that you're living in a high place? This is comparative information. If you're on the plateau, would you call your land Tope or Tepe? It's possible that one might do so with the sense of grandeur, what a great and high place this is. But again, the problem is we find no attestation. And if you don't do that, then if you're not doing that, you can basically come up with anything you want, really. So this is extremely, extremely problematic. The other problem with this is. The other problem with this name, are you following me? I don't want to drown you in minutia and detail, but does it make sense so far? Okay. The other problem with this is that it sort of assumes this name Pe. Where does the name Pe come from? Well, it's localized in the south central Tibet, in the area of the Yarlung Valley. This is the dynasty that is Pe. Now, the Tibetans did not emerge fully formed, just out of nothing. I mean, even Tibetan legend will say, well, first there was a monkey and a rock ogress, and then they had children, and gradually they became human, etc. But the fact is, the Tibetans did not, the Tibet as we know it, or the formation of the Tibetan people, historically is something which I often compare to the formation of the Arabs as a people. That is to say that you have a small group in a certain area of the plateau, just as you have in the Arabian Peninsula, and they dynamically explode out of that area, overrun the peninsula. The Arabs would overrun the peninsula, and when the smoke and dust clears from the Atlantic Ocean to the Tigris and the Euphrates, everybody is an Arab. Now, we know an awful lot about the Mediterranean during the classical period, so we know who was there beforehand. With Tibet, you have a dynamic group that explodes out of south central Tibet, out of the Yarlung Valley area, overruns the plateau, spills over the plateau, so that you have areas even in what is Central Asia that were under Tibetan domination during the imperial period, that is from the 7th to the 9th centuries. And when the smoke and dust clears, and here I'm exaggerating somewhat, but I do it's for good effect. When the smoke and dust clears, everybody is the descendant of a monkey bodhisattva and a rock ogress. In other words, you have this sense of kinship. But what it really means is that the Tibetans form. This is a process which happens during the imperial period. Now, the idea that everybody on the plateau was Pe is problematic because this name, Tufan, does not come from the area of south central Tibet. That name, Pe, I should say, it is localized in the southern part of the plateau, and it's even in Vedic literature, you do find a reference to Bota. So we do know that it was known, but it wasn't all over the plateau. In fact, we have some idea of some of the peoples who were on the plateau, and they were not Pepa at that stage. They are mentioned in various sources. The Aja, these are the Tuyuhun in Chinese, Shangshung, Kyungpo, Sumpa. We have a number of, ethnic names, ethno-national names even, if you will, that are attached to various portions of the Tibetan plateau. It's not all Pe. And the idea that this name, which is from the south central portion of the plateau, would have been used in the areas abutting China is problematic. It's highly problematic. And what is particularly interesting is that we're told where the name comes from. The Jiu Tang Shu, this is the old Tang Annals. This is the official dynastic history of the Tang Dynasty. The Jiu Tang Shu actually gives us very explicit information. Essentially, the area bore the name of a clan, Tufa, and we know that clan was from the Xianbei. Okay, the Xianbei people who occupied the area around what is now the northeastern portion of the Tibetan plateau, just say east of Qinghai, of Koh-i-Noor. In that area, you had a Xianbei clan. The name was Tufa, and that was used for the area. This is not unusual that a clan name or the name of a human group becomes attached to an area. America is a personal name, okay? It's somebody's personal name. And I can assure you that the people living in North and South America prior to 1492 did not know they were living in America. Okay, these names are often used in that sense, and names travel as well. So what we're basically told in the Old Tang Shu, Old Tang Shu, it sounds like footwear. I'm sorry, the Jiu Tang Shu, the Old Tang Annals. That in that area, they basically had Tufa as the name of the state, and that by error we called it Tufan. In other words, that whole name, Tufan, rather than being some sort of accurate representation of a Tibetan name, is a mistake. And we know furthermore that, again, through rhyming dictionaries and all of that, we know that this Tufa name would have been pronounced Tupat. The Fa would have been pronounced something like Pat or Pat. And the Tufan, which you have there, would have been pronounced something like Pan. In other words, it has the final consonant at the end. If you're familiar with the preservation of certain Chinese words in Japanese or the way they're pronounced in Cantonese, you know that many of these words which have no final, tufa, actually did have finals in earlier times. So this would have been something like tupat. And what does tupat sound like? Not all at once. It sounds like Tibet. In other words, the name Tibet, which nobody on the plateau used, was basically a name used by outsiders. Again, America is one instance that I give you. There are others as well. It's always amused me that the Germans seem to have different names in every single different country, Niemiecki, Allemagne, Tedeschi, all of these different names, not what they themselves necessarily use. So here you have one area which gives its name on the border, which is associated with a clan, a pre-Tibetan Empire clan, and that name, which really applies only to that area east of the Kohinoor, east of Qinghai, then is used by Chinese historians for the rest of it. The interesting thing, one of the interesting things about this also is that prior to the Tang, there was contact between Tibet and the preceding Sui dynasty, but the Sui records don't use Tufan. They actually use a different name, and the Tang historians never make the link that these two references refer to the same country. In the Sui period, they use the term Fuguo, and it's very minor. There's like one or two missions, and they come from Fuguo, and it's fairly well established now that Fuguo actually is Tibet, geographically, its location, and the Fu would have been Pu, and it's assumed that this probably refers to Pugyel, one of the terms for the imperial house in Tibet, Pugyel. Sagopa Shepupu. Just spelling it out, okay? So anyway, this is what we have. Now the interesting thing, again, is that you have this Tufa, and it becomes Tufan for the Tang, but it doesn't become Tufan for everybody else. So the Turks referred to them as Tibet, Tupat. Which again reflects what we have with this Tufa. And from the Turks, the name goes to the Arabs, it goes to the Mongols. Eventually, through the Mongols, the name also goes to the Manchus. In the 18th century, during the Qing dynasty, you can find Chinese sources which use the term Tubuota, in Chinese, because this is under the Qing, in order to refer to Tibet. And that's the name that we get. So, and from the Arabs, it goes to the west, and we wind up with Tibet. All the while, the people living on the plateau are still using Pe, undisturbed, and that's the name. So the idea that Tufan, the last two over there, that Tufan should be read Tubuo, I have to say, represents an intrusion of politics into what really ought to be, an historical or linguistic issue. Okay? And finally, the Zhou Tangshu. There are two official dynastic histories of the Tang: the old Tang history and the new Tang history. The Tibet sections, and Tibet was extremely important to the Tang. Tibet gets 2 chapters in each one, which is not the usual way that you have it. It gets 2 chapters. Those chapters were translated in the 1980s. They were translated into Tibetan. And they were translated, the translators were Chen Qingying, who's a very good Tibetologist in Beijing, working together with Tundrup Gyel. And some of you may know Tundrup Gyel, who was a very famous poet, died tragically young in the late 80s. But the two of them translated it, and rather than writing Tufan or Tubor as the title, they wrote Tu Pe, but it was a B-H-O-D, if I Romanize it, Pe. It was as if they had to, this is published in, I think it was in Beijing or in Xining, I forget where it was published, but it was if they couldn't just call it Tufan, that would be too insubordinate. But they added a ha to it, so it's not exactly Pe. It has a ha there. Okay, this is one of the issues that I want to talk about. The second issue I want to talk about is this question of when did Tibet become a part of China? And this is in some ways for me it's fairly cut and dry. And I don't want to inflame passions or anything like that. I'm just going to stick to the facts. Okay. In the People's Republic of China, if you read anything which comes out of China, it generally says that Tibet became a part of China during the Yuan dynasty. Now, depending upon what source you read, you might not get the same time of the Yuan dynasty. Some will say that it became a part of China when the Yuan dynasty was established, which is 1270. Some will say it became a part of China when Sakya Pandita went to the court of Khotan, which is in the 1240s, and is even more interesting because there's no Yuan dynasty at that time. And then you get several others. And the problem, as I've often said, the problem with that is that there's actually no reference to any act or any document which made Tibet a part of China. Now, having said that, the pushback from the Tibetan side has been to say Tibet was independent. Now, I know this is somewhat arcane, but Tibet was not independent. It was clearly a part of the Mongol dominions, and it was clearly subject to the Mongols during this period. But the real, the question which I'm posing here is, did the Mongols take this part of their realm and make it a part of China? Because the Mongol Empire was quite huge. Tibet belonged to that part of the Mongol Empire which was subject to Kublai Khan, if you will, but Kublai. But Kublai did not see himself just as the ruler of China. He saw himself as the ruler of the Mongol Empire. And this is the way he styled himself, even though already during his reign period, the empire had begun cracking. He wound up waging a war of legitimacy against his brother Arik Boga. So this gets to be problematic. When did it become a part of China? Well, Yuan dynasty, when? There's actually no statement about that. And more to the point, if you look at the dynastic histories, the Zhou Tangshu is one dynastic history. The Mongols have their own dynastic history, the Yuanshi, in the Chinese style, and of course these histories are written by the succeeding dynasties. It's one of the actions that a dynasty does when it overthrows one to manifest its legitimacy. It writes actually you could almost say it writes the epitaph. It carves the tombstone of the preceding dynasty by writing its history. The official dynastic history of the Yuan dynasty like all dynastic histories, has certain structural forms. You start off with the chronological record by year, by month, sometimes by day, which is winnowed down from much, much larger records. Then you will get an economic section about the economics and regulations. You will get a geographical section giving the geography of the state. Then biographies and monographs on neighboring countries, and there are others as well. The interesting thing about this, the interesting thing is that, and by the way, you'll notice I often say the interesting thing because everything I say is interesting. So the interesting thing about this is that we have the administrative geography of the Yuan state in the Yuan Shi. In the history of the Yuan dynasty, you have the complete administrative geography, giving you provinces, prefectures, counties, the seats of prefectures, the seats of the provinces, all very, very detailed. And you know what? No Tibet. No Tibet, because Tibet is mentioned. Tibet is mentioned, of course, because when you're dealing with the history of the Yuan dynasty, you cannot omit Tibet, but it is not part of the administrative geography of the empire. So this business of when Tibet became a part of China becomes somewhat problematic. And again, just as with the name of Tibet, the idea that we have now that Tibet became a part of China during the Yuan dynasty is actually very, very modern. This is not something which has been derived from the writings of previous historians. In fact, during the Qing period, during the period of the Qing dynasty, Tibet is often referred to, for most of the dynasty, with terms that actually refer to vassaldom, some sort of feudal relationship. So you have a Fanbang, Fanshu, and these are really not, how shall I say, integral parts of a country. These are rather subject areas. And this is during the Qing period. The Qing period, for those of you who are not familiar, it's 1644 to 1911. It's the last imperial dynasty. And during the Qing period, there is not this perception that Tibet was part of China during the Yuan dynasty. Indeed, during the Republican period, that is the period of the Republic of China, 1911 to 1949 on the mainland. That is, it still exists on Taiwan. But during the Republican period before 1949, the idea which most historians have is that Tibet became part of China during the Qing period. And not only just during the Qing period, but actually not at the beginning of the Qing period, really in the middle of it. And this is, in the 1790s. So these are two quotations from Republican-era Chinese writers discussing Tibet. And both the 57 58 years, the relationship between China and Tibet was radically reformed. China's sovereignty over Tibet was firmly established and afterwards implemented in practical terms. In the current People's Republic of China, of course, the official line is that this happened during the Yuan dynasty. That is, since the Mongol period. That is, since the 13th century. Now, it's a funny thing about that, and I should say, I have a big enough ego to think that, oh yes, because of me, such and such happened. I've written about this, and I've been critical of this idea, and sometime around 2009, 2010, some official Chinese sources resurrected a theory from the early 80s that was proposed by China's premier historical geographer, a man named Tan Qixuan. He edited the Historical Atlas of China in 8 volumes, which is a very important research tool and resource. And he wrote an essay basically asking, what are the historical boundaries of China? And in that essay, he wrote that, and this is after I had, written my critique of he wrote this earlier, but the resurrection of this idea, and it was published in a number of places. He basically said that the historical boundaries of China are the boundaries of the Qing dynasty, that is the state established by the Manchus, at its peak. In other words, one should take those boundaries and then just read them back into history. That is what historical China is. Now, this sounds, how shall I say, difficult to sustain, but his logic actually is interesting. His logic was that just as in Chinese history you have periods in which there are several dynasties. After the Tang, there was a division of the land with 5 dynasties, but it was all nevertheless China. And indeed, in the period prior to the Mongols, you have the Liao and the Jin and even the Xia, the Xixia, established as dynasties on Chinese territory. The territory is split. So he said, what I am saying is not that the Tang dynasty ruled Tibet. Of course, that would really be pushing it back far. Although at one point there was that suggestion that the official line should be that. There was that suggestion. He says, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they both existed within the territory of China, and they constitute China, like split dynasties. That everything that happens within these borders is China. So essentially what this does is it makes Tibet China from time immemorial, which is a really rather difficult problem. When I said that, there was even the thought that maybe one could bring the date back to the Tang. It's interesting because you have, as I said, during the Republican period, the idea was that during the Qing dynasty, most historians would say during the Qing dynasty, Tibet became part of China. During the late 18th century. The People's Republic of China did not really start thinking about this until 1959. In the aftermath of the Tibetan Rising in 1959, you find people rushing to put out tracts and documents about Tibet and trying to figure out, and it's interesting because all of a sudden now they have to figure out when did Tibet become a part of China. And so you find that some writers are actually writing during the Tang Dynasty. That is, when the Princess Wencheng Gongzhu went to marry Songtsen Gampo, Tibet became a part of China. Of course, that gets rejected, and we now have this idea that Tibet became a part of China during the Yuan dynasty. Now, again, the pushback from Tibet, if I don't accept, and obviously from my tone of voice, I don't accept the idea that it became part of China during the Yuan period. The pushback from that, from the Tibetan side, is also something which I don't accept, and this is Dongtok Rinpoche, and he's writing about that period of the Tang dynasty, about the Yuan dynasty. The country of Tibet was occupied by the Mongol royal lineage for 49 years. Duda Drogon Trigya Pakpa of Sakya, he was the imperial preceptor to the emperor and the Tibetan who was in charge during the time of Hubei of all Buddhist affairs, not just Tibetan. Not even the life of one human being was afflicted, etc. Via the path of ahimsa and peace, the 3 Cholka, that's the Mongol term for a province, Cholkasum, and it's a Mongol term. They were freed from foreign oppression, and the civil and religious system existed with full independence. And this reflects a Tibetan interpretation which says that the idea that Tibet was subject to anybody during the Yuan period is a grievous error. And in fact, it was Tsepun Shakapa, whom I respect, but he was wrong about this. It's a grievous error resulting from the system of priest and patron. That is, you would have a lama who would be the lama to the emperor. The lama would serve the spiritual needs of the emperor. The emperor would protect the lama in the civil realm. The idea that Shakapa and others had is that people simply don't understand this. In fact, Shakapa writes, and it sounds somewhat excessively precious, I would say. He says that this is a system, our priest-patron relationship, which Westerners cannot understand. Now, I'm a humanist, and I believe that all human institutions are understandable to other human beings. I believe that that cultures can understand each other, that human beings can understand each other. But the idea that this is something, this priest and patron relationship, which Westerners simply can't fathom what it is, and therefore they think that it involves the subjection of one party to the other party. And the problem with that is that it is indeed something which is not necessarily political. You have this relationship between a ruler and a lama in instances where there is no political domination. There were Tibetan lamas at the court of the Ming dynasty following the Yuan. The Ming is 1368 to 1644, but the Ming did not dominate Tibet. But during the Qing period, the Manchus absolutely dominated Tibet, and you also had this so-called priest-patron relationship. So the relationship itself is completely separate. One cannot simply say, oh, there was a priest-patron relationship, therefore Tibet was absolutely independent. No, there was a priest-patron relationship, but there was also domination, and we have records, administrative regulations relating to Tibet from the Yuan court, which absolutely demonstrate that this was the case. This is also usually said for the Qing period, for the period of the Manchus. Oh my God, how much time do I have?
I don't know.
Yeah.
An hour is fine, I guess.
Okay, no, it's usually when, often we always worry about getting, at least at Indiana, about getting thrown out of the room. We only had the room to a certain time.
I see.
But, okay.
I don't know that.
Okay,
I think we're free now.
Yeah, okay. But don't worry, I won't hold you hostage for 5 hours. Okay, so during the Qing period, indeed, there was also domination of Tibet. But again, the idea that the Qing made Tibet a part of China is, I think, very difficult to sustain. And this brings us to an issue that goes beyond Tibet. It's something which has become very an issue of great sensitivity in the People's Republic of China, and that is the existence of a school of historiography called New Qing Studies. And New Qing Studies basically proposes that the Qing dynasty, like the Yuan dynasty, should be viewed as a Manchu dynasty. The Yuan was a Mongol dynasty, as a Manchu state, and that there are voluminous records from the state in Manchu, and that one cannot really study the Qing without looking at Manchu records. It's not enough to look at what the Chinese records say, one also has to look at what the Manchu records say. And if one looks at that, one sees that indeed the Qing state was an empire. It was not, and this is what writers in the People's Republic of China often project backward. They say it was a unitary multinational state. At least that's what they used to say. There's so many things which are changing and which we have to deal with. The status of the Tibetans. I just said a unitary multinational state, and this is what it used to say. But that multinational there. In Tibetan, it would be Mirigmangwa Yekap. In Chinese, it would be 多民族，是一个多民族国家。But that term 民族 in Tibetan Mirik, which used to be translated as nationality, so we say multinational, unitary multinational state, translated as nationality because the model of the former Soviet Union is what was being used. That has changed sometime, I don't know exactly when, in the last 15 years or so. The word from on high has come down that Minzu or Mirik should not be translated as nationality. It always was. In Beijing, you have Minzu Daxue, or Zhongyang Minzu Daxue, the Central University for Nationalities. It was mandated that Minzu now should be translated as ethnic group. nationality was considered. All of a sudden, somebody realized that nationality is a little bit too. It has the word nation in it and all that. So now, it's an ethnic group. To indicate just how problematic that is, the Minzu University, the Central University for Nationalities, as it were, has declined to change their name. And so they are now, in English, they are Central Minzu University. They just keep the Chinese Minzu there, and they don't translate it. But this is somewhat problematic. In any event, as I was saying, there's been, and it's been now about 30 years since this idea first began for new Qing studies. And there are there's a lot of Qing scholarship in the United States. Sinology in the United States in the 20th century, if one talks institutionally, it was dominated by a man named John King Fairbank at Harvard University, whose specialty was the Qing dynasty. And so Qing history has been very big in the United States. It's the most recent of the imperial dynasties. And so this idea that one should not look at the Qing simply as a Chinese state. One has to look at it as a Manchu state, as a Manchu empire. And this is considered anathema, but it's only been in the last 2, 3, 4 years that Chinese scholars have, shall we say, moved the front line to foreign shores. And so now you'll find, at international conferences, I was at one in which someone brought up New Qing studies apropos of nothing, essentially to denounce it. And I think people have been told that they have to be on the attack against it. And of course, what the person says, the person named several of the people associated with New Qing studies and said, "Why, these people can't even read Manchu." And for some of them, actually, it was true. But nevertheless, the basic idea is that it was a Manchu state. It should be studied as a Manchu state. When Tibet and Mongolia signed a treaty in 1913, a treaty, by the way, the text of which, I'm not putting the preposition at the end, the text of which was unknown for many, many years. It was only when the Mongols I think it was around 2010, they actually released photographs of the treaty that we actually saw the actual text. The very first line talks about Tibet and Mongolia emerging from under Manchu rule, Manchu domination. And then it goes on to say, and therefore, because of that, we have nothing to do with China anymore, meaning that the Manchu structure is gone, so they have nothing to do with China. This is one issue, okay? This is one of the issues. I'd like to talk about, I just very, very briefly, just about a few other things here. One is basically Tibet and the greater world. And one issue which I've looked at, and I want to go back and look at it some more, now that I'm retired I can do that, but it has to do with Tibet's place in the world economy. And it's something which occurred to me a number of years ago. The Columbian voyages changed the world. I mean, in many, many different ways. The crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, not just the actual crossing, but bringing the Americas into the view of Europe, into the flow of European history, changed the world. I'm not giving a value judgment or anything else. I'm just saying this is something which was absolutely incredible, as opposed to the Viking voyages, which really did not do anything like that. One of the things which they did, of course, is they changed the world economy because of the tremendous stores of silver which were found in the Americas and which the Spanish began to exploit. And this is in the 15th century, and this is not without repercussion elsewhere. It had tremendous repercussions, and I began to think, what did this do with Tibet? Because I tend to see Tibet as part of the world, part of the greater world. Now, we know an awful lot about China during this period. First of all, what I'm going to say now should be understood with certain caveats. I'm not saying that there was no silver in the world until the Mexican and Peruvian mines were opened by the Spanish. Of course there was silver. But the amount of silver just grew tremendously, absolutely tremendously. And particularly when the Spanish occupied the Philippines in 1565, they now had a point from which to transport the silver to Asia. And the China trade was very important, and all of a sudden the Spanish had huge stocks of silver, which was very valuable, with which to trade with China. And silver began pouring into China in a very round way. The period from 1550 to 1650 is often described as China's silver century. And so what I began to think of was how much of that silver made its way into Tibet. And so I began to look at these, and I have to, as I say, I have to say that our sources for this are not as well. They do not provide the sort of documentation that ideally we would like, but nevertheless, there are things there. We have, from the Ming period, the Ming Huidian, which is a very important compendium of government statutes. And it was completed in 1503, revised twice, finally in 1587. And these statutes have an awful lot of information. They talk about the sorts of things, for instance, involving tribute missions. And when I say tribute mission, because of protocol and hierarchy, a mission from a foreign state or foreign actors of any sort very often are described in Chinese sources as tribute missions, even though they might be diplomatic, they might be commercial, but they're generally described as tribute missions when they come to the court. And there are always reciprocal gifts which are given. And in let me see, does that? Okay, monastic robes and hats should be on one line, so there shouldn't be that. That goes on one line. This is what we find in the Ming Huidian for the sorts of gifts that are to be given to Tibetans who come to court. This includes lamas and includes others, but this is what should be given to them. And again, this is in the Ming Huidian, which reached its final form in 1587. And the interesting thing is we find gold leaf, but we find no silver. There's no silver there. Now, when I said, very, very interesting. Then, when I began to look at the veritable records of the Ming Dynasty, the court records that were kept, these are the records which ultimately get boiled down into those chronological records in the dynastic histories. And they give sometimes day to day, multiple entries for days of what was going on at court. And so I took a look, and I'm not going to give you all of these things, but just the conclusion of 54 recorded specific reciprocal presentations made to Tibetan hierarchs by the Ming court after 1550. Fully 22 can be said to have involved silver. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's no regulation about giving silver. In the actual statutes up to 1587. So clearly, silver begins to come into Tibet. And more than that, we find silver making its, we find silver in certain Tibetan records even being used by petty kings. The king of Jangsatam is all of a sudden is giving silver, which normally, previously, would have been considered extremely precious. Now he's giving silver, something that you would not necessarily expect to find. Now, again, as I say, with Chinese historiography, we're very lucky. We have all sorts of records which deal with the economy. With Tibetan sources, where, there is information. and you have to know how to read it. But Tibetan materials are not indexed. You go to to the official dynastic history. You have chapters. You have subheadings for the chapters. It's very easy to get through. You're interested in the economic activity of a certain monastery. You basically have to get out the biographies of the various hierarchs and other records and start going page by page by page by page. Which, is not so bad, because that means you really have to immerse yourself in Tibetan sources. Okay, so this is one of the issues which I think indicates, it really does indicate a Tibetan engagement, for want of a better word, engagement with the larger world, or that the fact that Tibet was part of the larger world. And indeed, not simply that, but in the 17th century, we have the ledger of an Armenian merchant who traveled to Lhasa to do business. And he mentions his daily expenses in Tibet measured in silver. He mentions them in silver. Now, by the 17th century, of course, silver from the New World is also making its way into India, and the Armenian merchant comes via India. New World silver coming to Tibet essentially came from the Philippines to China. It went from the Philippines to other Asian areas, but then to China, and from China to Tibet. New World silver coming to India basically came through Europe. This was silver that was shipped to Spain, and then through the Mediterranean, and it transited the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals were really part of this one large world. So it went that way, and it's generally felt that it was only a century later that the silver really has an impact in India, whereas previously its impact is in China. Okay, one last thing. It's sort of one and a half things. I want to talk about, again, this is another, it has a lot of ramifications. Tibet as a part of Mongolia. I've spoken about this before, and I'm not clinically insane. I do know where Tibet is on the map, and I know where Mongolia is on the map. But Tibet really was, in many ways, a part of the Mongol world, very much a part of the Mongol world from the mid-17th century to the mid-18th century. Again, these are large centuries, but the period from the 5th Dalai Lama's taking power with Mongol force, putting him on the throne, into the middle of the 18th century is, for me, Tibet's second Mongol century. The first Mongol century was the time of the Mongol Empire, of Hubelai and Pagpa, that priest-patron relationship that we talked about. But the Mongol place was extremely important. This is from a Tibetan autobiography. The author is a man named Dorjen Pandita Kashipa. And he's very interesting. He is one of the people that completely botched up Tibet's relations with Nepal. And as a result, he was summoned to the Qing court to answer for his incompetence. The whole account also makes it clear that, if anyone had any doubts, that the Tibetans were indeed subject to the Qing, to the Manchus. Again, the same caveat as before, it does not mean that the Manchus made Tibet a part of the Chinese area of their empire. But absolutely, he was subject to the emperor. He makes it clear. And when he was at one of the first interrogations that he had, or questionings, it's quite interesting. They say, what are these two earrings that you're wearing? Because he was an official. He had, very specific earrings. And he said that wearing of a turquoise was an old Tibetan custom, meaning that it really is symbolic of the old empire. And the wearing of a pearl is a custom that spread when the royal lineage of the Khokhanor king, that is Khokhanor, Qinghai, Tsongun, Tsongunbo, Tsongun, Gushri Khan when they were kings of Tibet. And Gushri Khan, of course, had been, quote-unquote, king of Tibet in the 17th century. Now, the interesting thing about this person, I said this is Tibet's second Mongol century. The author, Doring Pandita, had served on the border with Nepal because of his mismanagement in part his mismanagement, a war erupted between Tibet and Nepal, and that war was only resolved when the Qing dynasty, in really what was a very, very daring and expensive effort, sent Qing forces over the Himalayas to the Kathmandu Valley. And I mean, it's really an incredible feat, but it also cost the Qing dynasty a tremendous amount of money, and the emperor was very angry. And Doring Pandita was summoned to Beijing. Now, he'd never been in Mongolia, but when he meets the Qianlong emperor, the two of them converse in Mongol. So when I say that Tibet in many ways is really part of this larger Mongol world, this is what I mean. The Mongol terms that you have in Tibetan nowadays, Emchi for doctor, Cholka and Cholkasum, these words really come at this time. They don't come during the time of Kublai Khan and Pagpa. They come during this period. And they come into the language of central Tibet, not the areas closest to Mongolia. So you really have Tibet as a part of this this Mongol world, and the Mongols at this time are very much a part of a greater Manchu Mongol world. So you have Tibet, which in many ways is being integrated into this larger Manchu Mongol world. The Manchus were extremely important in the structure. Rather, the Mongols were extremely important in the structure of the Manchu realm. Of all the, how shall I say, the peoples within the empire, the Mongols were probably the closest to the Manchus. I would say even closer than the Tibetans. Mongolia is today an independent state. Tibet is not. History sometimes moves in interesting ways. But during this period, during the time when the Kokonor Mongols, the Khoshot Mongols under Gushri Khan installed the fifth Dalai Lama in 1642, installed him in power, it really was a combined Mongol-Tibetan operation, and the state was very much a joint Tibeto-Mongol enterprise. Certainly the armies, the very, how should I say, the pedestrian way, the very general way, almost vulgar way, I could put it like that, of describing this period is that the Mongols come in, they are patrons of the fifth Dalai Lama, they install him in power, and then they go off to the Dhamma area just as nomads, and they leave the Dalai Lama to run the Tibetan government. And that's really, how should I say, it's not the full story. It's really not the full story, because the Mongols really do remain the powerful force, but they do so with Tibetans by their side. It's not an exact comparison, but so few British were able to rule India, not because they just ruled India by themselves, but because they had Indians in their armies, Indians in their bureaucracies. And the Mongols in Tibet, in many ways, the very same thing. So the most important Tibetan at the beginning of the 18th century is a man named Miwang Pola, or Polane. And we have a very long biography of him, which is a very important literary work because it's a secular biography. I'll say some more about that in a minute, but this is one instance. Here in the biography, it talks about the Mongols and the Tibetans essentially going out to, for want of a better word, I'll say to play war games. And of course, practicing for war involves hunting. Which is very common for the Manchus, for the Mongols. And here he's talking about them all together, and you had Tibetan soldiers and you had Mongol soldiers, and they would compete against each other. It was not simply a question of Mongols ruling Tibet. Now, finally, I'm going to say, this is, I think you've suffered enough, so I'm just going to say a few more words about one small subtopic, something that I've been working on, and I'm continuing to work on, and it's the question of modernity in Tibet. And I'm not one of these people that says, oh yes, Buddhism is very modern, and therefore Tibet was, internally modern, as opposed to the West, which was externally modern. No, because Tibet was a part of this Manchu-Mongol world, it also received some of the same effects. The whole question of modernity in China is a big one. Some people approach it through the perspective of saying, well, when did East and West diverge? Kenneth Pomeranz, The Great Divergence. The idea is that into the 18th century, actually, China was not backwards compared to Europe. And something happened, and this is something I don't want to get into here, but basically there was a divergence, and Europe streamed ahead, and China fell backwards and fell prey to imperialism, etc., etc. Now, the China that they talk about, of course, is the Qing dynasty, and that is that Manchu-Mongol world of which Tibet was indeed a part. I generally tend to say that, and maybe some of you will understand this, in Chinese Marxist theory, you have this teleology that society moves, from slave society to a feudal society to a capitalist society, and there are all of these anomalies. So when China's supposed to be feudal, you find all of these uses of capital and things like that, and so the way around that is has always been to say, oh, these are sprouts of capitalism. In other words, it's not capital; it's just sprouts of capitalism, and so I tend to see in Tibet sprouts of modernity, but they, in many ways, they don't come to real fruition. But the fact of the matter is that during this period, during the 17th century and the 18th century, the English and the French and the Portuguese are pouring into India. Well, they're slowly flowing into India. The Russians are pouring into Siberia, where you have Mongolia, the border with the Manchus and the Mongols. This is changing an awareness of the world, a view of the world, and an understanding of what is out there. Already in the 17th century, as the ledger of our Armenian trader indicates, there were European goods that entered Tibet. Not an awful lot, but there was this level of contact. And you had European trade entering Mongolia as well. In Beijing, you had Russian residents. The Russians, by the way, because they came over land, had a very different status from the French and from the Dutch and from the British in China. Their status was akin to that of the Mongols, and so they had the right to come. They even had their own hostel where they could stay with Orthodox priests and all of that in Beijing. And from them, including Kovalevsky, a Pole who was this is a time when Poland was part of the Russian Empire. Through them, an awareness of the larger world was coming into being. I mentioned Miwang Pola, this great leader in the early 18th century. I mentioned his biography. Is it coincidence? Maybe it is, but there's something very interesting. Miwang Pola has his biography written. He is not a monk. He is not a monk. And his biography does not tell of great visions and great teachings, Buddhist teachings. It talks about battles. It talks about his getting titles, his overawing his enemies, and it is a huge book. It represents, I believe, in its scale, in the size of it, and its scope. It was printed during his own lifetime for distribution. He wanted it to be distributed, and he wanted it to be read. As the colophon says, he told the author, and he had, in fact, he had a lot to do with the writing of the book. He told the author he wanted it to be readable to idiots, by idiots rather. He doesn't really say. He says people with dull minds. He wanted them to be able to understand it. Now, the person who wrote the biography is one of the great literati, I should say, in Tibet. His name is Dokar Shabdrung Tsering Wangyal, and he's also the author of, at the same period, what is generally considered to be Tibet's first novel. Now, I mention these things because these are sort of the characteristics that people raise when they talk about modernity. And so you wind up with a secular biography, novel, and Dokar Shabdrung Tsering Wangyal, the author, writes his own autobiography, and he's secular as well. And when I say secular, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that, I don't mean secular to indicate someone is anti-clerical. That's not the case. We're talking about Buddhist believers, all of them. But nevertheless, not monks. So you have, a secular autobiography, a novel. These are the sorts of things that had history gone otherwise, one could see as the beginnings of a certain kind of Tibetan modernity. Polanyi also, what is interesting is that he ruled Tibet. He was the most important person ruling Tibet, and his rulership of Tibet comes right in the middle of the period of the government of the Dalai Lamas. Indeed, the 7th Dalai Lama, when Polanyi is in charge, 7th Dalai Lama is exiled from Lhasa for 7 years. So, this, perhaps it might have gone some other way. By the early 19th century, an awareness of the rest of the world is coming in. The Zamling Geshe in 1820, 20-something, Lama Zempo Nomin Khan, a monk who is in Beijing and in contact with people at the Russian residence, writes and publishes what is Zamling Geshe, an extended discourse on the world, in which he talks about Europe and Asia, even mentions the Americas. This is something which is quite new. In 1865, the Moravian missionaries, and for those of you who studied Tibetan language, Yeshki's dictionary. Yeshki was one of the Moravian missionaries. The Moravian missionaries publish a tract in Kelong on the southern side of the Himalayas, Sachembo Sewe Melong, a mirror illuminating the great earth, if you will. And it has what I think is that clear? I don't know why it's so. I'll have to make a better copy. It has what I consider to be the first Tibetan language modern map. And it's a map of Asia, although you see Africa, you see the Arab, and Hindu. And China, by the way, is there as China. So whoever drew this map could not qualify for the Hong Kong Council with that pronunciation. But anyway, you have all of these things, but 1747, Polanyi dies. His son takes over. This might have been a secular dynasty, but his son is murdered by the Qing representatives in Lhasa, and that brings that to an end, and we're back to hierarchical rule. This has been, some really scattershot reflections on certain issues in Tibetan history. So I'm going to stop here, and as I say, you've suffered enough, and if you want to suffer some more, then you can ask some questions, okay? So thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed for this very rich talk, and I invite your questions, comments.